Hey all, so today we're going to have a chat about a bit of a different type of injury. Now this is something that is a pretty hot topic at the moment, rightfully so, and it's something that we have to manage quite differently than injuries that that we might have talked about previously where we're using that right or harm, and that's concussions. So concussions, especially with rugby being as popular as it is in New Zealand, are unfortunately very common over here. Our rates are quite a lot higher than a lot of other countries. On the flip side, we do actually manage them very, very well. So firstly we'll go over having a look at what a concussion actually is, because there's a bit of confusion around this. So a concussion is a brain injury. Now, in the medical literature, not that be reading a huge amount of that, but it's often referred to as a mild traumatic brain injury, that being distinct from moderate to severe traumatic brain injuries. So moderate to severe ones are things we might see with severe car crashes, or where people have skull fractures, or much more severe sorts of brain injuries. A concussion though still is a brain injury. The main distinction between the two is that a concussion is a disruption of brain function rather than of brain structure. So generally, if someone has a concussion and we were to scan them and have a look at the brain and see exactly what's going on, we're not going to see a lot in the scans, because there's not a lot of structural damage with a concussion check. Ideally there's no structural damage, and that's again that distinction between a concussion and a more severe traumatic brain injury. But just because there's not a lot of structural damage doesn't mean that it doesn't kind of mess things up quite a lot. The brain's incredibly complex and can be quite delicate. So disrupting function really can mess with people. So concussion occurs when the brain is subjected to forces that kind of exceed its ability to manage. Often this will be with a direct impact, so it will be someone knocking the head, it will be a high tackle in rugby, it might be someone falling and knocking the head, but we can get a concussion without the direct impact. With say a big tackle, legal tackle, and someone's getting hit really hard, head's going all over the place, that can be more than enough to cause a concussion. Same thing when we're seeing motor vehicle accidents, nose to tails oftentimes can lead to concussions. Basically there's a little bit of space between the skull and the brain, and that little bit of space is mostly there as a cushion to try and sort of help the brain not to allow it to move a little bit. But when you're stopping quickly, your brain's not stopping quite as quickly, just because of momentum, and kind of rattling around a little bit inside the skull. So direct impacts are not actually needed for a concussion. Now the other big misconception that people have around concussions is that you need to be knocked out to be concussed. This is completely false. It's actually quite rare to be knocked out with a concussion. Around 10% of cases 10% of individuals who are concussed do show loss of consciousness. If you do lose consciousness, it's a really good sign that there's probably at least a concussion there, if not something more severe. But just because someone hasn't been actually knocked out doesn't mean that they're clear from a concussion, not by any means. Let's have a bit of a chat about how to spot concussions. So the big thing with concussions, and the reason that they are a very challenging thing for us to manage or diagnose, is that they're incredibly variable. So there's a huge amount of different potential symptoms with concussions. So these range from things like dizziness, nausea, blurred vision, memory loss, changes in mood, changes in sort of attitude and personality almost, to headaches. It's a huge range of stuff. The intensity of an impact does play some role in a concussion, but it's not actually that strongly linked. So you can have quite a nasty head knock, and oftentimes if you do, you're going to have at least some level of concussion, but sometimes people can get through that with pretty minimal symptoms. On the flip side, it's not uncommon at all for people to have just a little bit of a knock or something that's just a little innocuous little head knock, whether it's in football going up for a header or something like that, and just a little bit of a clash of heads, and then have quite severe symptoms that can often last quite a long time afterwards. So just because something looks pretty minor. If it's your kids on the field or your mates on the field or whatever, and it gets a little bit of a knock, they're not being soft if they're complaining of dizziness and things like that. It doesn't take a lot of the time to cause some pretty severe symptoms. One of the things that's really important is, especially if you're playing with your mates or you've got your kids playing, you know them best. If they're acting quite differently than usual, if they're very they're very slow, the speech is slurred, or they just feel off, even if they're not directly complaining about being dizzy or nauseous or feeling sick or anything like that, or headaches. If you know they've had a head knock and they're just not right, that in itself can be enough to for us to be quite suspicious of a concussion. With any concussion, any suspected concussion, the first thing we need to be doing is removing people from play, and that's for the rest of the game. You've obviously seen at Super Rugby levels or at international levels, we often do the head injury assessments, the HIAs. Those are done by sports docs in the stadiums. Those players we have pre-injury data to measure that against. And even if the players are completely passing all of those tests, if the sports doc or whoever, the physio, isn't happy with that player's not getting back on. At lower levels of rugby, even Premier level or whatever, or school level, we don't have that luxury, and that's not a risk we can look at taking. So if someone comes off with a suspected concussion, they're off. And we treat that as a concussion until we're pretty sure it's not, and that burden of evidence to prove that someone's not concussed is actually pretty high, mostly because the risk of missing that concussion can be pretty severe, and can result in some pretty nasty stuff. The other thing with concussion symptoms is they are often a little bit delayed. Yeah? So you can have a head knock, feel completely fine at the time, and it's not uncommon for that person to wake up the next day and just be an absolute mess. Be dizzy, be nauseous, have all those concussion symptoms, come on much later on. And oftentimes that does lead to a more prolonged recovery, but just because they're not feeling absolutely abysmal at the time doesn't mean they're not concussed. So all of this is basically leading us, we have to err on the side of caution with this stuff. So again, rule one, make sure if we're suspecting concussion, that player is removed from play. In terms of managing this concussion, what you can do in these early stages is make sure they're relaxing a bit, okay? That they're not getting too riled up, they're not getting too overstimulated. We want them, if they're on the sideline, we want them on the bench, we want them relaxing, we want them sitting down, trying to get the breathing under control, trying to get the heart rate down a little bit. And then from there, over the next few days, making sure that we're not overstimulating them. So going back to a harm thing a little bit, something like alcohol can be a really big issue with concussion. We did mention briefly how alcohol does affect the central nervous system, and it really doesn't play well with that. That's even more important with an individual who may have a concussion. That's not going to go well at all. Alcohol is an absolute no-no with anyone who has a suspected concussion. A really good idea to be avoiding, again, a lot of stimulation, so watching TV, going out to town, bright music, bright lights, that kind of stuff. It doesn't sound like it's oftentimes a lot of extra stimulation, but your brain's working pretty hard to understand that stuff, and if it's already not functioning as well as it should be, that can often lead to bringing on a lot more symptoms and things like that. So trying to keep people in a decent environment, a little bit stimulating, but nothing too insane, nothing too moving, bright lights, none of that kind of stuff. Just keeping people nice and calm and just relaxed. If you're suspecting anything more severe with the concussion, so if someone's been vomiting quite a lot with it, or if they lose consciousness again later, or something like that, those are signs that this could be a lot more severe than a run-of-the-mill concussion. Not that those aren't severe in themselves, but this could be something potentially life-threatening. In those cases, we want to be getting these people to hospital as quickly as we possibly can, and letting someone who knows exactly what they're doing have a good look at this. Now, one of the most valuable resources we have when it comes to concussion management are the concussion clinics. The main one of these, which is fully funded by ICC, so no charge at all for anyone that's being treated there, is the concussion clinics at Access SportsMed. They do absolutely incredible work. It's an unbelievably useful resource to have available to us, especially considering that there is no charge. Access requires anyone that's being referred to the clinic, you can self-refer, that most people do self-refer to the clinic, I'll put a link to their website as well as their number. Either or are absolutely ideal. They do require people to be to present to clinic within, I believe, 10 days of the event, of the concussive event. They've got a couple of different clinics around, so they've got one here in St John's, just up the road. We're in GI, they're just up the road from us, and they've got another, I believe, in Glenfield up on the North Shore. They do morning clinics a couple of times a week at these, and they, again, the value and the speed of recovery that these clinics provide is incredible. This is not something that's common throughout the country, also internationally. Generally, we do need people to have a doctor's clearance to return to sport, to things after a concussion. So that can often be a little bit difficult to manage, because you're often bouncing between a physio who's managing the primary concussion, and then you go to your GP for clearance. GPs are brilliant, but concussion's not their area. Some GPs are phenomenal in that space, but a lot of the time it's not their specialist area. So they're not going to be able to, make decisions to the same level as our sports docs would, who do deal with this thing day in, day out. So having access to them through these clinics is absolutely invaluable. Strongly recommend anyone, regardless of whether it's a sports injury or you just slips in the kitchen and knocked their head on the counter. Either way, I'd strongly recommend that anyone who is concussed go and see the doctors and everyone else at Access Sports Med. Again, can't overstate how valuable these clinics are. For rugby, when we're talking about return to play, now the IRB does have pretty strong rules about players returning to play after a head injury. These are they're changing a little bit around now, but the general idea is that there's effectively a 3-week stand down from the time of concussion. It's a little bit of a split here between players who are under 18 and players who are over 18. Under 18, I believe, is 21 days, whereas over is 23. So what that effectively means is that our older players who are recovering really well and completely symptom-free by that point can end up missing 2 games and potentially playing for the third, whereas our younger players, we have a slightly extended recovery time, which means that they will miss those 3 games. These are rules that are pretty strongly enforced by the IRB and by Rugby New Zealand, and they're very important. Early return to play when somebody just hasn't recovered from the concussion can cause some severe damage, can put them at serious risk of things like second impact syndrome, which can be deadly. And we do lose a couple of people every year to oftentimes to returning too early to play after a concussion. That's something we want to be avoiding at all cost. A lot of other sports don't have these same guidelines as rugby. Football has a long way to go in the management of concussion. It's a different video. They've really got to step up the game there. So for any of our football players out there, you guys have to kind of take it upon yourselves to be sensible around this. You don't have those same restrictions. Staying out for a few games, really good idea, even if it feels completely fine. Oftentimes you find, especially with football where you're hitting the ball a lot, and then once your heart rate gets up, it can bring on symptoms pretty easily. So it's a really, really good idea to let your brain settle down properly, to do this rehab properly. Again, get in to see the Access guys, they're amazing. Just make sure you're managing this properly before you're getting back onto the field. Concussion isn't something you want to be messing around with, so if you do suspect that your mates, yourself, or your kids have had a concussion and that it's anything more severe than a standard concussion, there is no harm at all in getting them through to the ED, getting them through to the doctors, double checking everything. And then if they're cleared through that, that's mean they're not concussed, get them through to Access. Even if you're not quite sure if there's a concussion, that's fine. None of us are quite sure either. That's why we play it safe and treat every suspected concussion as a concussion until proven otherwise. We don't need a definitive diagnosis for this stuff, but get them through to the Access Sports guys. Again, they do incredible work, and it's a resource that we're incredibly lucky to have here. Cool. Thanks again for watching. we'll keep the series on injury management and things like that going. Yeah, look forward to our next video.